Richard Benjamin Speck was born in Kirkwood, Illinois in 1941. Richard was the seventh of 8 children of his father, Benjamin Franklin Speck, and mother, Mary Margaret Carball. Soon after Richard Speck's birth, his family moved to Monmouth, Illinois. His mother, Mary, was very religious and a teetotaler, which is a person who never drinks alcohol. Richard Speck was very close to his father. When Speck was just 6 years old, his father died from a heart attack at the age of 53, and the death was very hard on him. 3 years after the death of his father, Richard Speck's mother married a traveling insurance salesman named Carl Lindbergh. She met Lindbergh during a train ride to Chicago. Lindbergh was a traveling insurance salesman from Texas. He was also a man with a vast criminal history, with a 25-year criminal record that ranged from forgery to several DUIs. Lindbergh was also a hard drinker, which was the polar opposite of Richard Speck's father. Speck hated his stepfather, who was often drunk and verbally abusive. Richard Speck struggled in school. He repeated the 8th grade and failed almost every class. Speck started drinking alcohol at the age of 12, and by the time he was 15, he was getting drunk almost every day. Speck finally dropped out of school in January of 1958. Richard Speck soon started a life of crime. He would marry Shirley Malone in 1962 and have a daughter, but the two would divorce in 1966. Speck became very angry when he learned his ex-wife had remarried only 2 days after she was granted the divorce. Speck would eventually return to Monmouth, Illinois. It was here where Richard Speck would take his crimes to a whole new level. On April 3rd in 1966, 65-year-old Miss Virgil Harris returned home at about 1 a.m. to find a burglar in her house brandishing a knife. The man blindfolded her, tied her up, sexually assaulted her, ransacked her home, and stole the $2.50 that she had earned babysitting that evening. Miss Harris described the burglar as a 6-foot-tall white male. He was very polite and spoke very softly with a southern drawl. That burglar was Richard Speck. 1 week later, 32-year-old Mary Catherine Pierce, a barmaid who worked at her brother-in-law's tavern, Frank's Place, in downtown Monmouth, was last seen leaving the tavern at 12:20 a.m. on April 9th. Mary Pierce was reported missing on April 13th, and her body was found that day in an empty hog house behind the tavern. Richard Speck was a regular at Frank's Place, and the empty hog house was one of several that Speck had helped build. Mary Pierce had died from a blow to her abdomen that ruptured her liver. She would be Richard Speck's first victim, but not the last. On July 14, 1966, a voice could be heard screaming through the early morning hours of the southeast side of Chicago, Illinois. The person screaming was a young nurse named Corazon Amaro. She was screaming from the second story of a townhouse on East 100th Street, where she had managed to push the window screen out and scream for help. She screamed out, "They are all dead. They are all dead. My friends are all dead. Oh God, I'm the only one alive." Corazon was a nursing student from the Philippines. She applied to work in the United States for a better opportunity. She was working in Chicago so she could send money back to her family in Manila. She was the only survivor of the brutal nightmare that had happened inside of the townhome. Only days before, Richard Speck had arrived in town. Speck had applied to the National Maritime Union for a job position on a ship. But when he arrived to claim the job, he found it had been mistakenly given to someone else. And this sent Richard Speck into an anger-fueled binge of alcohol and drugs. With nothing but time on his hands now, Richard Speck broke into the home of a woman and sexually assaulted her before stealing her gun. Soon after, at around 11 p.m. on July 13, 1966, Richard Speck broke into the 2319 East 100th Street townhouse in Chicago's Jeffrey Manor neighborhood, sneaking in through the window. Due to the woman's chilling screams from the window, the police were called and authorities arrived at the townhome. As they entered, they found the bodies of 8 young women, all of which were student nurses at South Chicago Community Hospital. The 8 victims were Gloria Davy, Suzanne Farris, Patricia Matusek, Jo Schmale, Pamela Wilkening, Merlita Gargullo, and Valentina Pasion. Corazon Amaro was the survivor. According to this lone survivor, Richard Speck broke into the townhouse and used his gun to force 3 nurses into a bedroom. As they entered the bedroom, Speck found 3 more women. Richard Speck tied the women's hands and feet in nautical knots with strips torn from the bed sheets. Later that evening, 3 more nurses had come home, only to confront Richard Speck. He once again threatened them and tied them up as well. Speck assured the 9 women that he was only going to rob them. After stealing from the women, Speck took them into separate rooms, killing them one by one. Muffled screams could be heard as each woman was led to her death at the hands of Richard Speck. He killed each woman in various ways, either by strangulation, stabbing, or slitting their throat. But during his murderous rampage, Richard Speck would lose track of how many women were in the house. The 9th woman, Corazon Amaro, hid under her bed and waited until 6 a.m. the following day before leaving her hiding place. This was when she crawled out onto a second-story ledge of the townhome and screamed for help. The police responding obtained a detailed description of Richard Speck from Corazon, and a sketch of Richard Speck was placed on the front page of every local newspaper the next morning. Speck spent the next 2 days hiding out at a $1-a-night hotel. A drifter named Claude Lunsford would eventually recognize Richard Speck from a sketch of the murderer in the evening paper and phoned the police. But even with records showing that the call was made, the police did not respond. It wasn't until Richard Speck attempted to take his own life that the Star Hotel desk clerk phoned them. Speck was transported to Cook County Hospital, where he was recognized by Dr. Leroy Smith. The doctor read about the 8 nurses being murdered and remembered that the killer had a "Born to Raise Hell" tattoo on his arm. The police were called and Richard Speck was finally arrested. Speck would deny killing the 8 nurses, but later confessed to the murders when he spoke to Chicago Tribune columnist Bob Greene for an article about the murders. He would also state in a later interview that he was high that night, but did not blame drugs as a mitigating factor. He would say that he could just as well have done it sober. On April 15, 1967, with a star witness and tons of evidence, after only 45 minutes of deliberation, the jury found Richard Speck guilty of all counts of murder and recommended the death penalty. Speck was sentenced to die by the electric chair, but granted an immediate stay pending automatic appeal. The Illinois Supreme Court subsequently upheld his conviction and death sentence on November 22, 1968. On June 28, 1971, the U.S. Supreme Court upheld Speck's conviction but reversed his death sentence. But that was not the end of the story of Richard Speck. Speck was not a model prisoner. He was often caught with drugs or moonshine. He would often say, "How am I going to get into trouble? I'm here for 1,200 years." Speck was nicknamed the Birdman while in jail. One story was that Speck found an injured sparrow that had flown in through one of the broken windows. Speck took care of the injured bird and nursed it back to health. Once the sparrow healed, Speck tied a string to its leg and had it perched on his shoulder. After some time, a guard told Richard Speck that pets weren't allowed. So Richard Speck walked over to a spinning fan and threw the small bird in, killing it instantly. The surprised and horrified guard asked Speck, "I thought you liked that bird." Speck replied, "I did, but if I can't have it, no one can." In May 1996, Bill Curtis, who was a Chicago television news anchor at the time, received videotapes made at Stateville Correctional Center in 1988 from an anonymous attorney. Shocked by what he eventually would see on them, Curtis took the tapes to the Illinois state legislature. The videotapes, made from within the walls of the correctional center, showed explicit scenes of sex, drug use, and money being passed around by prisoners who seemingly had no fear of being caught. And one of the main stars of these videos was Richard Speck.
Do you like being by men?
Absolutely.
Have you always liked being by men?
Sure.
You wearing blue pants today?
Yeah.
Can you see? Take on that cover.
Huh?
Take on that cover.
Take one?
Oh, yeah. How you feel after killing those ladies?
Like I always felt. Had no feeling. Yeah, because I felt sorry and anything. No. Yeah, Joey, you know what you thought I was having. But it turned me loose.
One video shows Richard Speck performing oral sex on another inmate, as well as sharing a large quantity of cocaine with another inmate. Disturbingly is how Richard Speck looks, how his persona had changed. Speck is seen parading around in silk panties. His hair is longer, his demeanor very feminine, and he is now sporting what appears to be female-like breasts, which were allegedly grown using smuggled hormone treatments. During the video, Richard Speck would say, "If only they knew how much fun I was having, they'd turn me loose." During the video, a man from behind the camera, presumably a prisoner, asked Richard Speck if he had killed the nurses. Speck would respond by saying, "Sure I did." When asked why, Speck would say, "It just wasn't their night." When asked how he felt years after the murders, he said, "Like I always felt, had no feeling. If you're asking me if I felt sorry, no." He was also asked about what it felt like killing someone, to which he responded, "It's not like TV. It takes over 3 minutes, and you have to have a lot of strength." Richard Speck died on December 15th in 1991, presumably from a heart attack. Speck's sister feared that his grave would be desecrated, so Richard Speck was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in an undisclosed location.